All Blacks coach Scott Robertson is 5 games into his All Blacks coaching career, folks. How have his first 5 games gone? Well, he's certainly come under the microscope for especially the loss to Argentina, but also against England, where we didn't exactly blow Steve Borthwick's team off the park. 4-1 is the record for the first 5 games. How does that compare to some other kind of recently successful coaches? I'm looking at Rassie Erasmus from South Africa. He's obviously won the Rugby Championship and a couple of World Cups with his time in charge of the Box. Andy Farrell, who won 6 Nations and has had his side at times #1 in the world with Ireland. Fabien Galthié has also won the 6 Nations during his tenure. And then how does he compare to the previous All Blacks coach, Ian Foster, across the first 5 games? We'll compare them, and you guys can let us know your thoughts on how much you can read into the first 5 games. Because I've seen a lot of comments about, well, you know, Super Rugby is different from international rugby. Razer's getting a lesson in kind of coaching. I don't know that we can tell from 5 games what the kind of finished product is going to be personally, but obviously time will be the test. Now, how did Razer go? As I said, he played 2 games against England. It was number 3 ranked New Zealand. It's just the squad he's inherited from Ian Foster. The squad is largely stable, but as with every World Cup cycle, with the All Blacks at the end of the World Cup cycle, we lose veterans. So for the All Blacks in this World Cup cycle, it's the likes of Aaron Smith, Sam Whitelock, Brodie Retallick, and others. Shannon Frizzell left the picture, so Richie Mo'unga is also a kind of big one as the kind of gap at number 10. So Razer gets a pretty highly ranked side, runners up at the World Cup, but without some of these guys who've decided to kind of head overseas or retire. That's the squad he inherits. So not in a bad place, but certainly in a place to kind of build up. They play a number 5 ranked England side who also performed pretty well at the World Cup and have had their coach in charge for a wee bit longer, and Steve Borthwick. 2 from 2, but the results are relatively close, 16-15 in Dunedin and 24-17 at Eden Park. Third game is against Fiji at a neutral venue in the States. That's number 3 ranked New Zealand against number 10 Fiji. 47-5 is a bit of a hiding. Razer's able to kind of mix it up and play some of the kind of newbies onto the scene. And then 2 games into the Rugby Championship, both against Argentina. That kind of shock loss. I say shock because the All Blacks were big-time favourites for that game. 38-30, they lose to the Pumas. And then they kind of bounce back with a win, 42-10 at Eden Park. So that's Razer's first 5 games. Hasn't yet played an opponent world rankings-wise who is above them. Has played the majority of the games at home, just 1 game at a neutral venue, and has lost 1 game at home, so finishes 4-1. How does that compare to Rassie? Now, Rassie took over the Springboks in a very different position. It wasn't the end of a World Cup cycle. It was the middle of the World Cup cycle. 2018, he takes over the Springboks with Alistair Coetzee, having had a pretty poor run the year before. I think he was 7 wins, 4 losses, and 2 draws in 2017, which for the Springboks is a pretty bad return. So Alistair Coetzee gets sacked. Rassie comes in as coach, and he's basically tasked with rebuilding the squad. Because remember, the year before was the 57-0 game. So they'd had some pretty low lows in that 2017 year. He's got to rebuild the squad, find the players he wants to take forth to 2019. Remember, they said at the time their target was more 2023. The 2019 might be kind of too soon to properly challenge for the World Cup, but hey, he managed to get both. So he certainly takes over a side in a different position from Razer. It was a side that was maybe lacking on a bit of confidence and needed to kind of rebuild itself. His record with the Box over the first 5 games, he manages to get 3 wins and he has 2 losses. There's no draws in there for Rassie. The first game is a loss. That was kind of like that, I don't want to say hastily organised, but I believe it was kind of more last-minute organised game against Wales, in which Rassie blooded a bunch of guys who, some of them only ended up with that 1 Springboks cap. So it was trying to seeing a bit of more depth. Like Travis Ishmael got a cap in that game. Opal Mahoje played in that game. Rob Dupree played in that game. And it was a 22-20 loss to Wales over in Washington. Bit of an ugly game from what I remember about it. Wales were ranked number 7 in the world at that time. The Springboks were ranked number 6. So 22-20, kind of an even game. and certainly a bit of an experimental one for Rassie. Game 2, they start the first of 3 games against England. England are coming to town after having had a poor Six Nations, although England do outrank South Africa in terms of world rankings. It's number 3 England against number 7 South Africa at that point. But as I said, England have finished 5th out of 6 teams in the Six Nations. So England at that point, under Eddie Jones, are on a really bad run. And it continues in South Africa. The Boks get the first 2 games, 42-39 and then 23-12. Both those comeback wins after England had early leads. And then for game 3, they get the second loss. That one is at Newlands. It's a 25-10 loss. But in that game, Rassie had already secured the series, so he makes 5 changes. And it's the changed side which ends up losing. You feel like when there's a 3-game series, sometimes that's the way it happens. If it's a kind of nothing game in terms of the overall series, it's got a little bit less kind of meat about it. So the coaches often on both sides change things up. The 5th game of Rassie's first 5 is a home win over the Pumas. First kind of rugby championship game for that campaign where they win 34-21. So 3-2 for the first 5 games for Rassie. Did he go on to win his inaugural rugby championship? No. They ended up coming second that year to the All Blacks, but they did win it the next year. And of course, they won it the World Cup the same year as well. So, yeah, I think they won their home games and lost the 3rd one, which was at home against England. But overall, you could see that Rassie was trying to identify the talent amongst the guys and bring forth a squad which would eventually head to Japan. Andy Farrell, also a different position where he takes over because he takes over from the kind of assistant role. Razer has taken over the All Blacks from completely on the outside, which is a very different thing for New Zealand, where it's been tended to be in recent times passed down from coach to assistant, Graham Henry to Hansen, Hansen to Foster. Now we've got an outsider taking the reins in terms of Razer. So Andy Farrell had the kind of reins taken over from Joe Schmidt, who was his predecessor. And he also has the same record as Rassie across his first 5 games. He goes 3-2-0 in the Six Nations, albeit COVID-affected Six Nations. 2 of the games for Ireland in that Six Nations 2020 were fanless because of COVID restrictions. So they get underway against Scotland. It's 5 in the world, Ireland against 9 in the world. Scotland, remember, taking over after a kind of disappointing Rugby World Cup campaign in 2019. But with largely a pretty stable squad. The Irish hadn't had kind of wholesale changes. Like Rory Best had retired, but they hadn't had, like it wasn't like Sexton and Murray and kind of Armani and all the veterans that are still knocking about today, apart from Sexton. It wasn't like a bunch of those guys had all kind of retired after the World Cup. So it was a largely pretty stable squad and a bit of a handover from master to apprentice, I guess. They start with a close win over the Scots, 19-12. It's 5th up against 9th in terms of the world rankings. And remember, Ireland's always got the wood over Scotland, so it wasn't an emphatic win. Then they beat Wales, also at home at the Aviva, 24-14. Wales are actually ranked above Ireland at that point, 4th against 5th in the world rankings. And then the first loss comes at Twickenham to eventual champions England. And then 3rd game against Italy is much delayed with the COVID restrictions, but then 50 points to 17. And then the 5th game is one they dropped to France, 35 points to 27. So 2 away games, that's a Twickenham and a Stade de France. They lose both of those, but they win their 3 games at home at the Aviva. Did they go on to win their first Six Nations under Andy Farrell? No, they didn't. They were kind of average in that first year. They never really kind of got humming like the side that we see now, which is partly why I think you don't necessarily judge a coach based on the first 5 games. But yeah, that was Andy Farrell's initial run. And what about Galthié? He also ends up winning a Six Nations. His run is slightly better than Rassie and Andy Farrell in terms of his first 5 games. 4-1. He goes in that Six Nations campaign, comes bloody close to winning the Six Nations in his first crack. Remember, he was with the French squad in 2019 before he took over as kind of full coach. He was there as an assistant during the World Cup. Takes over a pretty young squad. You feel like Galthié was kind of tasked with taking a lot of these youngsters and trying to get the potential from a lot of the youngsters as they kind of shifted away from some of the old guard. And they kind of got a little bit French on us in that initial campaign. Like they beat England in their first game, who were eventual champions, 24 points to 17, but concede a really stupid bonus point at the end of the game where Dupont kicks it out, thinking the time is up, but the time is not up. England eventually end up winning a penalty, kicking a penalty, getting a losing bonus point. That losing bonus point is the difference between England winning the Six Nations and coming second. So France, whilst they won that game at the time, they wouldn't know it, but that game would come back to kind of haunt them. Then they beat the Italians at home, 35-22. Not the most kind of convincing game, but that seems to be the way the French go against the Italians in the Six Nations. Then they beat Wales 27-23 at the Millennium Stadium. And remember, Wales are still ranked above France at that point. It's 6th against 5th. But then they dropped the game, which they maybe should have been winning, against 8th-ranked Scotland. Remember, I think it was Mohamed Hawass had a red card in that game for throwing a punch. They lose the game, which they potentially should have won, having already beaten England and having beaten kind of Wales away. And then with the COVID disruption, they beat Ireland in that final game, but don't get the points difference to win the Six Nations. So 4-1 for their first year, but still show that they are kind of, not quite the finished product. It would take them the third attempt to actually win the Six Nations. First time for both Andy Farrell and Galthié Charter Six Nations. First Six Nations for them, it's England that win it under Eddie Jones. Then Wayne Pivac wins it in that campaign where every bloody opponent seemed to get red cards, and then Galthié gets one, then Farrell gets one. So it takes a while for what they're building to kind of pay off. And what about our direct example, All Blacks coach against All Blacks coach? How did Fozzie go in his first 5 games? Remember, Fozzie also has to deal with COVID disruptions. 4 of the first 5 games Fozzie is in charge of are against Australia, because just with all the travel restrictions, they were one of the few teams we could actually play. South Africa didn't end up playing in the Rugby Championship that year. It was a tri-nations between us, the Wallabies, and the Pumas. Game 1 under Fozzie is actually a draw, so it's a kind of ominous start. That's at Wellington, where the All Blacks have most notably recently have a pretty poor record. They end up getting 2 wins, both of them over the Aussies, but they also end up getting 2 losses, 1 to the Aussies and then the first ever loss to the Pumas. So Fozzie's initial record, and people say that Fozzie wasn't getting stick from day one. Well, he was kind of getting stick from day one because his record from day one was pretty average. He's never been the most popular kind of appointment when Razer was waiting in the wings. But they gave the job to Fozzie, and he didn't come out of the blocks firing. The first game was a draw, like I mentioned, 16-16 down at Wellington. The Wallabies could have won that if Reece Hodge had kicked the final penalty of the game. So it's a draw. Second game's at Eden Park. It's an All Blacks win, 27-7. I think it was Caleb Clark's big game. And then game 3, they go over to Sydney and flog the Wallabies 43-5. But then, just as things are looking peachy, 2 losses. 1 to the Wallabies by 1 point up at Suncorp, where both teams get red cards. And then game 5 of his first 5 is that first ever loss to the Pumas over in Australia. So 25 points to 15 loss. So Fozzie's record, not the best. I mean, the guy does end up taking the team to a World Cup final, having inherited a pretty good team from Steve Hansen, albeit the kind of same transition. Whereas Razor's without Moonga and Whitelock and Barrett, Retallick and all those guys. Fozzie was without the likes of Sonny Bill and Kieran Reid and Ryan Crotty, all those kind of guys who had decided to, Ben Smith, had decided to kind of hang up the boots from All Blacks duties at the end of their campaign. So that's how Razor's record compares. He's obviously still got to travel to some away games, which some of the likes of Andy Farrell and Fabien Galthié had to do in their initial runs. We will see how he goes over in South Africa. But as I said at the kind of top of the piece, I don't think we can judge too much about how Razor is going to go until he's had a fair bit more time in charge. Coming from the outside, he's certainly going to be wanting to build things and do it his own way. There's been a bit of talk about potentially a bit of information overload for the players in those first few weeks. We'll see if they're kind of able to get things embedded in as things go on. Do you think Razor can live up to the billing and get trophies? The likes of Rassie, who's won multiple, Farrell, who's won 6 Nations, Galtier, who's won 6 Nations, Fozzie, who ended up winning multiple rugby championships and whatnot. But yeah, you guys let us know your thoughts. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already and want more rugby content, because it'll certainly be coming your way. Like the video, leave a comment, and yeah, you guys let us know your thoughts. Talk to you guys again soon. See you later.